The wind howled like a wounded beast against the timber walls of Broken Ridge when the timid knock came. Standing in the freezing Montana blizzard was a shivering young woman clutching a small boy. "Can we sleep in your barn?" she whispered. That question changed Isaac Montgomery's life forever. The winter of 1888 hit the Bitterroot Valley of Montana with a ferocity that old-timers like Ezekiel Farnsworth claimed hadn't been seen since the Great Freeze of '72. For Isaac Montgomery, the punishing weather was just another reflection of his own desolate existence. Isaac was a man carved from the harsh landscape itself, broad-shouldered, calloused, and worn down by a grief he refused to speak of. 5 years prior, he had buried his wife, Abigail, under the lone weeping willow behind the cabin. Since then, the door to the Broken Ridge Ranch had remained firmly shut to the outside world. It was a Tuesday evening when the blizzard reached its peak. The snow was falling so thick it looked like a solid wall of white beyond the frost-caked window panes. Isaac was sitting by the hearth, a cup of bitter chicory coffee in his hand, cleaning his Winchester rifle by the dim light of an oil lamp. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for a loose shutter banging in the gale, but it came again. 3 desperate, hollow thuds against the heavy oak of his front door. Isaac frowned, his hand instinctively gripping the barrel of his rifle. Nobody traveled up the ridge in this weather. To do so was a death sentence. He unbolted the heavy iron latch and pulled the door inward, bracing himself against the violently swirling snow. Standing on his porch was a ghost. At least, that's what his mind first registered. It was a woman, her clothes little more than frozen rags clinging to her slender frame. Her lips were a terrifying shade of blue, and ice had caked into her dark hair. But it was what she held against her chest that made Isaac's breath catch. Bundled in a moth-eaten wool blanket was a small boy, no older than 6. His eyes squeezed shut against the biting cold. "Please," the woman croaked, her voice barely carrying over the screaming wind. She didn't ask for food. She didn't ask to come inside. She looked at the hardened, heavily armed cowboy and asked the only thing her terrified pride would allow. "Can we sleep in your barn? Just until the storm breaks. We won't be any trouble." Isaac stared at her. The barn was only marginally warmer than the outdoors. Letting them sleep there would mean finding 2 frozen corpses by sunrise. For half a second, the isolated hermit in him screamed to shut the door, to keep the world and its relentless tragedies away from his sanctuary. But looking at the trembling child, a painful memory of the family he could have had pierced through his armor. "The horses don't take kindly to strangers," Isaac grunted, his voice rough from years of underuse. He stepped back and opened the door wider. "Get in here before you both turn to ice." The woman hesitated, her wide, exhausted eyes darting from Isaac's imposing frame to the rifle in his hand. But the boy shivered violently, and maternal instinct overrode her fear. She practically fell over the threshold. Isaac forced the door shut against the wind, dropping the iron bar back into place. The sudden silence of the cabin was deafening. He quickly stoked the fire, throwing 2 large pine logs onto the embers until a roaring blaze filled the room with golden light. "Put the boy by the hearth," Isaac ordered, pulling a heavy bearskin rug closer to the fire. "Take off those wet coats." The woman obeyed numbly. As she peeled away the frozen layers, Isaac got a better look at her. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with striking features hidden beneath layers of dirt and exhaustion. "I'm Amelia," she said softly, rubbing the boy's hands to return the circulation. "Amelia Higgins. This is my little brother, Toby." "Isaac Montgomery," he replied curtly, walking to his small iron stove to heat up a pot of stew he had made earlier that day. "You're a long way from any main road, Amelia Higgins. Traveling through the bitter root on foot in the dead of winter ain't just foolish, it's suicide." Amelia didn't answer right away. She pulled Toby closer, her eyes fixing on the dancing flames. Isaac noticed how she positioned her body, shielding the boy, her back tense, as if expecting the door to be kicked open at any moment. It was the posture of a hunted animal. "We got lost," she finally said, her voice tight. Isaac ladled the hot venison stew into 2 tin bowls. He set them down on the floor beside them, along with a heel of crusty bread. He had lived in the West long enough to know a lie when he heard one. You don't get lost on foot in a blizzard 30 miles from the nearest stagecoach stop. You run into it because what's chasing you is worse than the storm. He didn't press her. Not yet. He watched from his armchair as the two devoured the food with a desperate hunger. As the warmth of the cabin finally seeped into their bones, Toby fell into a deep, exhausted sleep on the bearskin. Amelia sat awake, staring into the fire, her shoulders finally dropping an inch. "Thank you, Mr. Montgomery," she whispered into the quiet room. "Isaac," he corrected softly, "and don't thank me yet. The storm's got us pinned. We'll be snowed in for days." For 3 days, the blizzard raged, burying the Broken Ridge Ranch under 4 feet of snow. The cabin became a pressure cooker of unspoken secrets and cautious glances. Isaac found himself falling into a strange domestic rhythm that he hadn't experienced since Abigail passed. He chopped wood, tended to his horses via the covered breezeway, and watched as Amelia brought a quiet, resilient light into his dreary home. She mended his torn shirts without being asked, cooked meals from his sparse pantry that tasted better than anything he had eaten in years, and kept little Toby quiet and respectful. Slowly, the ice around Isaac's heart began to thaw. He found himself lingering by the stove just to hear Amelia hum a soft Appalachian tune while she worked. He noticed the way her chestnut hair caught the firelight and the fierce, protective intelligence in her hazel eyes. But he also noticed the heavy canvas satchel she never let out of her sight. It slept under her makeshift pillow and stayed by her feet when she sat. The breaking point came on the 4th night. The wind had finally died down to a low whistle. Isaac was sitting at the wooden dining table, mending a leather bridle, when Toby accidentally knocked over Amelia's canvas satchel while reaching for a wooden toy Isaac had whittled for him. The satchel hit the floorboards, its leather strap giving way. Out spilled not clothes, but a heavy iron lockbox, several bundles of cash, and a stack of papers bearing an official wax seal. Amelia gasped, dropping the plates she was holding. They shattered on the floor, but she didn't care. She dove for the papers, her hands trembling violently. Isaac stood up slowly, the bridle dropping from his hands. His eyes locked onto the top paper before Amelia could snatch it away. It was a wanted poster, but it wasn't a standard bounty. It was issued by the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Wanted, Amelia Higgins, for the theft of $10,000 in property deeds. Reward, $500. Approach with caution. Silence hung heavy in the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Amelia gathered the items, clutching them to her chest, her breathing ragged. She looked up at Isaac, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "I'll pack our things," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We'll be gone before sunrise." "Sit down," Isaac commanded. It wasn't a request, it was an order steeped in years of ranch-born authority. Amelia froze, then slowly sank into a wooden chair, pulling a frightened Toby onto her lap. I don't harbor thieves, Amelia, but I don't throw women and children out into the freeze either, Isaac said, pulling up a chair opposite her. He leaned forward, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. You're going to tell me exactly what's in that box and who you're really running from. No more lies about getting lost. Amelia swallowed hard, realizing there was no escaping the truth. The money isn't stolen, she began, her voice shaking but gaining strength. It belongs to my family. The papers are the deeds to the Silver Creek gold mine down in Nevada. Isaac narrowed his eyes. If it's yours, why are the Pinkertons looking for you? Because the man who put out that poster is the man who murdered my father. Amelia spat, a sudden venom in her voice that surprised Isaac. Josiah Miller. Isaac's blood ran cold. Josiah, Blackwood Miller, wasn't just a name. He was a nightmare wrapped in an expensive suit. He was a corrupt cattle baron and railway tycoon who owned half the judges and lawmen from Cheyenne to Helena. He was known for ruthlessly crushing anyone who stood in the way of his expanding empire. My father struck a rich vein at Silver Creek, Amelia explained, tears streaming down her face. Miller wanted it. When my father refused to sell, Miller's men ambushed him. They shot him in the back. They were coming for Toby and me next, to force me to sign the deed over as the last remaining heir. She pointed to the lockbox. That night, I broke into Miller's own assay office. I took the deed, and I took the $10,000 he had offered my father. Money he considered payment after he killed him. I took Toby, and we ran. We've been running for 2 months. Isaac leaned back, rubbing his jaw. The gravity of the situation was immense. Harboring an ordinary fugitive was a crime. Harboring someone Josiah Miller was hunting was a death wish. Miller wouldn't just send the law. He would send his private army of mercenaries. Why Montana? Isaac asked quietly. My uncle, Arthur Pendleton, runs a general store in Missoula. I thought if we could make it to him, he could hide us, help us get passage to Canada. Amelia sobbed, finally letting the exhaustion break her. But the stagecoach was ambushed outside of Bozeman. Miller's men found us. We barely escaped into the woods. We walked for 2 days until we saw the smoke from your chimney. Isaac looked at the woman sitting before him. She wasn't a hardened criminal. She was a desperate sister who had risked everything to save her brother from a monster. He looked at little Toby, who was staring up at him with wide, innocent eyes. Isaac stood up, walked to the window, and wiped away the condensation. The storm had broken. The moon was casting a brilliant, silvery glow over the endless expanse of pristine snow. It was beautiful. But as his eyes scanned the distant ridgeline, his heart stopped. Silhouetted against the moonlight, sitting atop heavy winter horses, were 5 riders. Even from this distance, Isaac could see the moonlight glinting off the barrels of their repeating rifles. They were following the faint tracks Amelia and Toby had left before the snow fully covered them. Miller's men had found them. Amelia, Isaac said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly calm as he turned back to the room and reached for his Winchester. Take the boy. Get down into the root cellar, now. The heavy oak trap door to the root cellar groaned a bitter protest as Isaac hauled it upward, revealing a pitch-black cavity beneath the floorboards. Instantly, the damp, earthy smell of aging potatoes, dried apples, and cold dirt wafted up into the cabin, a stark contrast to the sharp tang of wood smoke. Get down there. Do not make a sound no matter what you hear. Isaac commanded, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that brooked no argument. He reached into his leather boot, pulling out a silver two-shot Derringer. He pressed it into Amelia's trembling palm, folding her cold fingers over the pearl grip. Then he handed her a heavy iron lantern, unlit. If that door opens and it isn't me, you point this at the center of their chest and you pull the trigger. Do you understand me, Amelia? Amelia's hands shook violently, her knuckles white as she gripped the small weapon. But as she looked down at Toby, who was clutching her skirts in silent terror, her jaw set with a fierce, maternal resolve that Isaac couldn't help but admire. "I understand," she breathed. She gathered her skirts and descended into the stifling darkness, pulling Toby tightly against her side. Isaac lowered the heavy wooden door, sliding the thick iron bolt into its housing with a definitive clack. To hide the seam, he dragged the edge of his heavy bearskin rug over the boards. For a fleeting second, he stared at the floor, praying the cellar wouldn't become their tomb. He turned his attention to the cabin. Moving with a fluid, methodical grace born from years of surviving the wild frontier, he extinguished the oil lamps one by one. The cabin was plunged into deep shadows, illuminated only by the dying, reddish-orange embers in the hearth. He grabbed his trusty Winchester repeating rifle from its mantel mount, stuffed 2 heavy boxes of brass cartridges into his thick canvas coat pockets, and took his position beside the heavy timber door. Outside, the crunch of heavy hooves on the frozen, crusty snow grew agonizingly loud. Isaac pressed his back against the wall, peering cautiously through a small firing notch he had carved into the window shutter years ago, a remnant of the Indian skirmishes of the 70s. 5 men sat atop heavily breathing draft horses, the animals' hot breath pluming like steam engines in the frigid, moonlit air. The leader, a massive man wrapped in a thick buffalo hide coat with a scarred, weathered face, held up a gloved hand to halt the procession. Isaac recognized him instantly from the faded bounty boards nailed outside the assayer's office in Helena, Elias Cobb. Cobb wasn't just a hired gun. He was a ruthless Pinkerton defector who hunted human beings for sport, a man with a reputation for leaving no witnesses. "Hello, the house." Cobb's voice boomed over the snowy expanse, carrying easily through the crisp, dead air. It dripped with a false, folksy warmth that made Isaac's blood run cold. "We know you're in there, Montgomery. We tracked the girl's footprints before the powder covered 'em up. We're looking for a woman and a little boy. Stole a mighty lot of money from a respectable businessman down south. Send 'em out, and we'll ride off into the night. No trouble for you. I swear it on my mother's grave." Isaac didn't answer. He didn't even shift his weight. He carefully slid the cold steel barrel of his rifle through the firing notch, resting the iron sight squarely on the center of Cobb's chest. He slowed his breathing, settling his racing heart. "I know you're a widower, Isaac," Cobb shouted, his horse shifting restlessly, sensing the tension. "I know you just want to be left alone up here on this God-forsaken ridge. Don't die for a thief. She ain't worth bleeding out in the snow for." When the howling wind was his only answer, Cobb dropped the friendly facade. His face twisted into a snarl, and he spurred his horse backward out of immediate range. "Burn him out," he barked to his men. "Leave nothing but ashes." 2 riders immediately dismounted, pulling heavy, corked glass bottles filled with kerosene from their leather saddlebags. They pulled rags from their pockets, ready to light the makeshift firebombs. They didn't even make it 3 steps toward the porch. Crack. Isaac's Winchester roared, the explosive sound deafening within the tight, wooden confines of the cabin. The first man dropped instantly, a .44 caliber bullet catching him square in the shoulder. His kerosene bottle slipped from his grasp, shattering against a frozen rock and spilling its highly flammable contents uselessly into the deep snow. Crack! Isaac levered the rifle with lightning speed. The second shot clipped the heel of the other man's boot, sending him scrambling on his hands and knees for the cover of the heavy wooden water trough near the barn. "Fire! Tear the cabin to splinters!" Cobb roared, drawing two heavy Colt revolvers from his holsters and blindly unleashing lead into the night. A hail of gunfire tore into the Broken Ridge Ranch. Bullets shattered the remaining window panes, raining sharp glass across the floorboards. Heavy lead slugs splintered the oak door and hissed angrily into the plaster walls, kicking up clouds of white dust. Isaac kept his head low, moving swiftly through the dark cabin. He fired, relocated to the kitchen window, fired again, and moved back to the door. He used his intimate knowledge of his home to his tactical advantage, making it seem to the men outside as though there were 3 skilled marksmen defending the property. He managed to drop another of Miller's men with a clean shot to the thigh, but the sheer volume of incoming fire was overwhelming. The air grew thick and acrid with the smell of burnt gunpowder. As Isaac moved to reload near the hearth, exposing himself for just a fraction of a second, a stray bullet punched violently through the thinning wood siding. It caught Isaac sharply in the side. Pain flared like a white-hot iron brand against his ribs. Isaac grunted, a harsh, breathless sound, falling heavily to one knee as hot blood immediately began to soak through his flannel shirt. He dropped his rifle, his vision swimming with dark spots as the wind knocked out of him. He pressed his hand against his side, feeling the slick, warm copper of his own blood. Outside, Cobb heard the break in the firing and the heavy thud of Isaac hitting the floor. "He's hit! Kick the door in and finish him!" Heavy, snow-caked boots pounded onto the wooden porch. Isaac fumbled desperately for his Colt revolver at his hip, but his fingers were numb and unresponsive. The heavy front door buckled under a massive kick, the iron latch screaming in protest as it tore from the wood. A second, brutal kick shattered the doorframe entirely, and the timber swung violently inward. 2 men stood silhouetted in the doorway by the pale moonlight, their repeating rifles raised and pointed down at the bleeding cowboy. Isaac braced for the end, his hand still gripping his bleeding side. Suddenly, the floorboards behind him heaved upward. The trap door flew open with a violent crash, and Amelia surged out of the cellar like a vengeful spirit rising from the earth. In her hands, she wielded Isaac's heavy double-barreled shotgun, which she had pulled from its pegs over the fireplace before going into hiding. She didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. She leveled the heavy weapon at the doorway, her eyes blazing with a feral, terrifying protective fury, and she pulled both triggers simultaneously. The twin blast was catastrophic. A wall of buckshot tore through the doorway with the force of a cannon, sending the 2 men flying backward off the porch to land in a heap in the snowdrifts. Amelia dropped the smoking, empty shotgun, falling to her knees and gasping for air, the massive recoil having bruised her shoulder down to the bone. She scrambled across the floor surrounded by broken glass, tearing a long strip from her cotton petticoat and pressing it fiercely against Isaac's bleeding side. "You foolish, incredibly brave woman," Isaac wheezed, managing a faint, pain-laced smile as he looked up at her soot-stained face. Outside, there was nothing but the howling of the wind. Cobb, witnessing the devastating blast and losing half his men in the span of 5 minutes, realized the cabin was a death trap. Believing they were massively outgunned, the surviving men dragged their wounded onto their horses. The frantic sound of retreating hooves echoed down the ridge, fading into the stormy night. They were gone, but Isaac knew it was only a temporary reprieve. They'll be back. Isaac grimaced 2 hours later as Amelia finished binding his ribs. The bullet had passed clean through his side, a lucky graze, but one that left him weak. Cobb will ride to the telegraph station in Darby. He'll wire Josiah Miller. By tomorrow night, there will be 20 men on this ridge. Then we have to leave now, Amelia said, her eyes resolute. She was no longer the terrified girl on his porch. The fire of survival had hardened her. If we can reach Missoula, my Uncle Arthur will hide us. He has connections with the Canadian authorities. Isaac nodded weakly. He saddled his 2 strongest draft horses, wrapping their hooves in burlap to muffle their tracks and help them navigate the deep snow. By dawn, they were miles away, leaving the bullet-riddled cabin of Broken Ridge behind. The journey to Missoula was a brutal, freezing nightmare. For 2 days, they pushed through the treacherous mountain passes. Isaac drifted in and out of a fever, kept upright in his saddle only by Amelia's constant vigilance. Little Toby rode in front of Isaac, tucked safely inside the cowboy's heavy coat. When they finally descended into the bustling logging town of Missoula, it felt like stepping into another world. The streets were muddy and crowded, filled with merchants, miners, and lawmen. Amelia led them through the back alleys to the mercantile shop owned by Arthur Pendleton. Arthur, a stout man with a perfectly waxed mustache, ushered them through the back door with wide, nervous eyes. "Amelia, thank the Lord," Arthur breathed, locking the door behind them. "I received word of the stagecoach ambush. I feared you were dead." Amelia collapsed into her uncle's arms, weeping with relief. "Uncle Arthur, we need passage north. Miller's men are everywhere. We have the deeds and the money. We just need to get away." Isaac leaned against the door frame, his hand pressing against his bandaged side. Something was wrong. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He watched Arthur's eyes dart toward the heavy curtain that led to the front of the store. He noticed the way Arthur's hands didn't hold his niece with warmth, but with a stiff, calculating grip. "Of course, my dear," Arthur said smoothly, stepping back and looking at the canvas satchel in Amelia's hand. "Just give me the lockbox. I will secure it in the store's safe while I arrange the wagon." "No," Isaac barked, his voice cutting through the room like a whip. He unholstered his Colt, leveling it at Arthur's chest. "Isaac, what are you doing?" Amelia gasped, stepping between them. "Look at his boots, Amelia," Isaac said coldly. Amelia looked down. Arthur's boots were dry, but there were wet, muddy footprints leading from the front of the store to the curtain. Heavy footprints, multiple pairs. "Your uncle didn't just hear about the stagecoach ambush," Isaac sneered. "He told Miller exactly what route you were taking. Didn't you, Arthur?" Arthur's face drained of color. The heavy curtain was suddenly thrown aside. Stepping into the back room was Josiah Miller himself, impeccably dressed in a silk waistcoat, flanked by 3 armed thugs. "Very perceptive, Mr. Montgomery," Miller purred, his eyes locking onto Amelia. "Arthur here is a pragmatic man. He understood that a general store in Missoula is a pittance compared to a 10% stake in the Silver Creek gold mine. All he had to do was let me know when his wayward niece came crawling home." Amelia stared at her uncle in sheer horror, the ultimate betrayal. "Hand over the deeds, Amelia," Miller demanded, extending a gloved hand. "And I might let you and the boy walk out of here. As for the cowboy, he dies for killing my men." Miller's thugs raised their weapons, but Isaac didn't shoot. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a stack of papers, tossing them onto the wooden table. "You might want to read those before you start shooting, Josiah," Isaac said, a grim smile playing on his lips. Miller frowned, snatching up the papers, his arrogant expression completely shattered. "Where did you get these?" Miller hissed, his hands trembling. "When Amelia broke into your assay office, she didn't just grab the mine deeds," Isaac explained, stepping forward. "She was in a hurry. She grabbed the first stack of official papers she found in your personal safe along with the money. Over the last 2 days, I had a lot of time to read them by the campfire." Isaac looked over at Amelia, winking softly. "Turns out, Amelia stole your private ledger, the one detailing every bribe you've paid to the state marshals, the land surveyors, and the territorial governor." "Kill them!" Miller screamed, realizing his entire empire was in those pages. "I wouldn't do that," a booming voice echoed from the front of the store. The front doors swung open. Stepping into the shop was Federal Judge Hiram Knowles, flanked by a dozen heavily armed U.S. deputy marshals. Isaac had recognized the ledger's contents, and while Amelia had gone to find her uncle, Isaac had sent a street urchin to the federal courthouse with a single ripped page of the ledger as proof. "Josiah Miller," Judge Knowles announced, stepping past the curtain, "you are under arrest for federal corruption, murder across state lines, and conspiracy. Drop your weapons." Faced with a dozen federal rifles, Miller's thugs immediately threw their guns to the floor. Miller stood frozen, his empire crumbling into dust in the span of 60 seconds. He lunged for Amelia, but Isaac was faster. The cowboy brought the heavy butt of his Colt down hard on Miller's jaw, sending the tycoon crashing unconscious to the floorboards. "That's for the door you broke at my cabin," Isaac muttered. Months later, the spring thaw finally reached the Bitterroot Valley. The weeping willow behind the Broken Ridge Ranch was blooming with green life. Isaac stood on his newly rebuilt porch, watching the sunrise. He wasn't alone. Toby was in the yard, laughing as he chased a barn cat, while Amelia stood beside Isaac, wrapping a warm shawl around her shoulders. She slipped her hand into his, her touch warm and grounding. Isaac squeezed her hand back. The ghost of his past had finally been laid to rest. He had opened his door to a storm, and the storm had brought him back to life. The tale of Isaac and Amelia proves that sometimes the deepest healing comes disguised as a furious storm. Against a backdrop of historical greed and the harsh realities of the Montana wilderness, two broken people found salvation in each other's courage. Isaac's isolated existence was shattered, not by the bitter cold, but by a desperate knock that forced him to protect, to fight, and ultimately to love again.